What would you do if you were Lewis Hamilton and discovered that your own team ignored a deadly car fault, just so as not to compromise aerodynamics? The 2025 Singapore Grand Prix was not only one of the most disastrous events on the calendar for Ferrari, but also the moment when the truth began to emerge about a structural problem that had been brewing since the early days of the SF25 design. An urban race with high temperatures, tight corners, and prolonged braking zones is the perfect environment for any mechanical weaknesses to be exposed. And that's exactly what happened. But the story goes much further than a simple technical failure. This was the start of a storm. During the technical meetings prior to the final design, there was a bifurcation in the structural decision of the car. On the one hand, braking system specialists proposed redesigning the internal ducts to allow greater airflow, even if that meant modifying the anchoring of certain chassis elements. On the other hand, the aerodynamic department was strongly opposed. They considered that this modification would reduce the efficiency of airflow under the flat bottom, a crucial aspect for performance on high-speed tracks such as Silverstone, Monza, or Spa. The pressure to maximize downforce in these scenarios led to a decision that today seems unsustainable: maintaining the original design, even knowing that it would be vulnerable on tracks like Singapore. But after lap 59, he realized the system was collapsing. It wasn't just a loss of performance, it was a progressive degradation of the left front system. With each corner, the brake responded less until it stopped. The really serious thing was that, internally, Ferrari already knew that something like this could happen. Riccardo Adami himself, his race engineer, showed signs of nervousness in his radio responses. When Hamilton first reported that he was losing brakes, the reaction was to suggest that he lift his foot before braking, a common technique to reduce system temperature. But that is not a solution to a structural failure. It only delays the inevitable. Ferrari had built a car with a weakness that it could not afford in certain conditions, and did not take the necessary steps to correct it. And the most disturbing thing for Hamilton was understanding that this weakness had been known before. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of a conscious choice. A technical decision that prioritized speed in qualifying and performance on straight lines, over reliability and safety. In that moment, everything changed. Hamilton was no longer just a driver facing a difficult race. He was the protagonist of a much deeper story, in which his life, his reputation, and his trust were being put at stake for a failure that should never have happened. And I knew it. That awareness is what transforms this breakdown story into a true storm, one that was just beginning. Radio communications between driver and engineer are, many times, the only real window we have into what is happening inside the car. But in Singapore, those broadcasts never made it to fan screens. They were not part of the official summary. They were not mentioned by the commentators. They were omitted, hidden. Until days later, a leak changed everything. What those internal recordings between Lewis Hamilton and his track engineer, Riccardo Adami, revealed was a level of tension, helplessness, and frustration that no other message had conveyed until then in the season. On lap 60 of the 62 that the Singapore Grand Prix had, Hamilton breaks the silence. "Losing my brakes, mate." There was no drama in his tone, just a direct statement. A warning with the coldness of someone who has experienced this type of situation before, but at the same time cannot believe that it is happening again. Adami's response was almost mechanical: lift and coast, a common technique to reduce thermal stress on the brakes, by lifting the foot off the accelerator before braking. But that suggestion at the time was inadequate, because Hamilton wasn't talking about mild overheating. I was talking about total loss of response in the left front braking system. What is truly revealing is how the conversation evolves. Just a few seconds after the first message, Hamilton speaks again. "Yeah, I'm losing big time." That second sentence wasn't just an update. It was a warning. The system was going down, and fast. It was no longer a controllable degradation. It was an imminent collapse. At this point, the driver was losing confidence not only in the car, but in the decisions of the pit wall. He knew it, and he let it show. On lap 61, his tone changes. His voice becomes more urgent. The words are more direct. "I've lost my brakes, lost my left front." It is not a hypothesis. It's not a warning. It is a confirmation. The left front brake is gone. And what comes next sums it all up. Adami, trying to comply with the instructions of the regulations, reminds Hamilton not to cut the corners, to respect the track limits. It is at that moment where the Briton's message becomes a silent accusation. "I'm not trying to cut the course, mate." His tone is not aggressive. It's dry. As if he couldn't believe that, in such a critical situation, his engineer's concern was a simple penalty. What these exchanges reveal is something much deeper than brake failure. They reveal a disconnect between the pilot and his team. A dangerous disconnect, especially in an organization like Ferrari, where technical decisions have always been subject to layers of internal politics. What on another team might have been a clear order to withdraw for safety, here was a vague instruction to finish the race without risking penalties, as if the performance of a point was worth more than the integrity of the driver. And here is the detail that changes everything. These types of messages should not have been necessary. If the failure was predictable, if the simulations had anticipated it, if there was already awareness within the team about the vulnerability of the brakes on certain circuits, then why was no action taken in advance? Why wasn't the driver warned about the risk before the race? Why was the response so lukewarm, so slow, so disconnected from the real gravity of what was happening? Hamilton, experiencing this sequence of messages in real time, was not just dealing with an unruly car. He was also understanding that he had been put in that situation by a combination of technical decisions, communication failures, and an internal hierarchy that prioritized aerodynamic design over functional safety. This realization, captured in each of his radio responses, was what marked the breaking point. From then on, it wasn't just a breakdown. It was a revelation. One that exposed not only the engineers who remained silent during design meetings, but also a team culture that, to protect a technical concept, forgot that Formula One remains, above all, a competition of people. And people, when they feel betrayed, rarely remain silent. Hamilton, without raising his voice, said it all in 3 sentences. And those phrases, although they were not televised, are now history. What happened at Ferrari after the Singapore Grand Prix was more than just a routine technical check. It was an internal shock that removed the foundations of its organizational structure. A kind of earthquake that exposed the institutional fragility of a team that, despite its history, continues to face the same mistakes as always. On the surface, there was talk of a brake problem. But internally, what really broke out was a technical war. A direct confrontation between departments, design philosophies, and ways of understanding Formula One. The first to react were the engineers in the mechanical systems area, especially those directly linked to the design of the brake cooling system. They had raised their voices since the beginning of the SF-25 project. They had warned that the current ducts were too narrow to guarantee effective heat dissipation on routes with low cornering speed and high braking frequency, such as Monaco, Hungary, or of course Singapore. The data was on the table. The simulations confirmed it. Even alternative redesign proposals had been prepared. But those proposals never made it beyond the first drafts. They were archived by direct order of the aerodynamic department. The area led by those in charge of the design of the flat bottom, the suspensions and the vortex generators, imposed its criteria. At Ferrari, as at many top teams, the battle for every millimeter of aerodynamic efficiency is fierce. And the brake redesign required cutting out parts of the chassis that interfered with airflow in the rear diffuser. In a car where the difference between a victory and a retirement can be defined by 1/10 per lap, any alteration to the aerodynamic balance is considered a direct threat to performance. That tension escalated into an open dispute. After the Singapore race, at the performance analysis meeting, a high-level discussion took place between the technical leaders of each area. What used to be a structured and technical analysis degenerated into cross-reproaches. Systems engineers claimed that their warnings had been deliberately ignored. The aerodynamicists defended themselves by claiming that the pressure to maintain the competitive pace against McLaren and Red Bull left them no room for maneuver. Vasseur's management tried to mediate, but failed to calm things down. The real problem, however, was that everyone knew Hamilton was right. And that made it even more uncomfortable. Because if a driver who had just arrived at the Scuderia this year had been able to detect a structural weakness just by driving the car under pressure, what did that say about Ferrari's internal technical validation process? What did that say about the flow of information between the track, simulator, and design department? In this context, Ferrari must not only face the immediate consequence of the ruling in Singapore. You must rethink your technical structure, your communication channels, and your internal decision-making culture. Because what Hamilton revealed, without needing to raise his voice, was that Ferrari remains a team trapped between the fear of failing and the fear of changing. And if they don't resolve that duality soon, the 2025 season could be another missed opportunity. Another one on a list that is already too long. Do you think Ferrari should publicly acknowledge the technical error in the SF-25? Or do you think these types of compromises are inevitable in a sport where every thousandth counts? How long should a driver like Hamilton last before demanding internal changes? And what implications does this have for the future of the team? I want to read your answers in the comments.